B. He prayed with the dead as if they were alive. Hello, everyone. Before we begin this disturbing story that took place in 1917 in Nebraska, tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. Are you at home, commuting, or maybe alone in the dark? And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Because trust me, after you discover what Father Augustin Mora was hiding in the depths of his chapel, you'll never look at a place of worship the same way again. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss anything, because the darkest stories of humanity deserve to be told, and this one will chill your blood. Stay until the end, because what was discovered in that chapel defies comprehension. Winter 1917. It fell upon the small town of Belmont, Nebraska, with unusual cruelty. Snowstorms followed freezing nights, and the wind howled between the wooden houses like a cry from another world. In this isolated village of fewer than 300 souls, life followed an unchanging rhythm, dictated by the seasons, by work in the fields, and by faith. At the heart of Belmont stood St. Mary's Chapel, a modest gray stone building whose steeple reached toward a perpetually gloomy sky. It was there that Father Augustin Mora had served for 12 years. He was a man in his 50s, with a sharp, austere face and eyes of an almost transparent blue eyes that seemed to look beyond appearances, as though he could perceive truths invisible to ordinary people. The townspeople of Belmont respected Father Mora, but that respect came with a quiet, unspoken fear that none could clearly explain. Perhaps it was his voice, always low and measured, as if whispering secrets. Or perhaps it was his sermons which had grown darker and darker, obsessed with the corruption of the flesh, the inevitability of decay, and the need for absolute purity before God. Death is an insult to divine creation, he had declared one Sunday morning, his thin silhouette framed against the chapel's frost-dimmed windows. The rot that devours our bodies is the work of the evil one, but faith, faith can perform miracles you cannot imagine. In the worn wooden pews, the faithful exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret Hoffman, a widow in her 40s who ran the village grocery, nervously clutched her rosary between her fingers. Beside her, her 17-year-old son Thomas watched the priest with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The boy had always found Father Mora strange, but lately something had changed. The priest seemed even more distant, more consumed by thoughts he never shared. After Mass, as the congregation stepped out into the biting cold, Thomas noticed that Father Mora did not follow them as usual. Instead, he turned back toward the altar and disappeared through a side door, a door Thomas had never seen anyone use before. "Mother," he whispered, "do you know where that door leads?" Margaret frowned. "To the chapel's basement, I suppose. Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Thomas replied, though his gaze remained fixed on the closed door. That night, lying in his narrow attic bed, Thomas couldn't sleep. The wind moaned through the boards of the roof, and within that sound he thought he heard something else, distant murmurs, faint, rhythmic, like a prayer whispered again and again. He rose, stepped to the frosted window, and looked toward the chapel. Through one of the ground-floor windows, a flickering light shone. Father Mora was still awake at this late hour. But what could he possibly be doing, alone in that cold, silent chapel, while the rest of the village slept? In the days that followed, Thomas began to pay closer attention. Thomas began paying attention to details he had previously ignored. He noticed that several people had disappeared from Belmont over the past few months. John Peterson, a farmer in his 30s, had never returned from what he'd said was a trip to Lincoln. Young Mary Sullivan, whose family lived on the outskirts of town, had apparently left the region to join some cousins in the east, or so her father claimed. Yet, he seemed strangely reluctant to talk about it. The Great War was raging in Europe, and many attributed these disappearances to young people leaving for the cities or to enlist in the army. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. These people had vanished without saying goodbye, without giving any real explanation, leaving behind families too uneasy to ask questions. One February afternoon, as another snowstorm brewed on the horizon, Thomas met his childhood friend Daniel Cartwright in front of the village blacksmith's forge. Daniel, a strong 19-year-old apprentice blacksmith, had calloused hands hardened by long hours at the anvil. "Have you noticed anything strange lately?" Thomas asked in a low voice, making sure no one could hear them. Daniel stopped blowing on his frozen fingers and looked at his friend curiously. "Strange like what?" "Disappearances. John Peterson, Mary Sullivan, and that woman passing through, what was her name again? Mrs. Hashford. No one's seen her since she came for the Christmas Mass." Daniel frowned. "Times are hard, Thomas. People go elsewhere looking for a better life with the war and all, but they never come back, not even for the holidays, not even to say goodbye. It's like they just vanish." He paused, troubled by his own words. "What are you suggesting exactly?" Thomas hesitated. What he was about to say sounded insane. "I think it has something to do with Father Morrow." A heavy silence followed. Accusing a priest, even indirectly, was a grave act in a community as devout as Belmont. "That's a serious accusation," Daniel finally whispered. "I know, but I can't help thinking he's changed. His sermons, his eyes, he looks at people like he's evaluating them. And then there's that door at the back of the chapel. No one knows what's beneath it." Daniel thought for a long moment. "And what do you propose we do?" "Go see tonight." Night fell over Belmont, bringing its familiar cold and darkness. Thomas and Daniel met at midnight, near the old oak tree standing by the entrance to the cemetery beside the chapel. Their breath formed small white clouds in the icy air, and their hearts pounded, not only from the cold but from fear. "Are you sure you want to do this?" whispered Daniel, his voice trembling. Thomas nodded firmly. "We need to know. If I'm wrong, we'll find nothing and go home. But if I'm right—" He didn't finish his sentence. The two young men moved silently toward the chapel, their footsteps muffled by the fresh snow. The windows were dark. Father Morrow was apparently asleep in his small rectory behind the church. Thomas had checked earlier. He'd seen a light still glowing there, proof the priest wasn't in the chapel. The main door was locked, as expected, but Thomas knew of a window on the north side with a broken latch. With Daniel's help, he forced it open just enough to squeeze through, then helped his friend follow. Inside, the chapel was shrouded in near-total darkness, softened only by the faint moonlight filtering through the frosted windows. The pews stood like rows of shadowed shapes, and the altar loomed at the back, a dark, menacing mass. A strange odor hung in the air, a mix of candle wax and something else, something sweet yet nauseating that Thomas couldn't identify. "This way," he whispered, lighting the small lantern he had brought. The trembling circle of light revealed the path to the side door he had noticed before. It wasn't locked. When Thomas pushed it, it opened with a long, shrieking creak that seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. The boys froze, holding their breath, but no sound came from outside. Behind the door, a stone staircase led downward into the darkness. The strange smell grew stronger, thicker. Daniel gripped Thomas's arm. "I don't like this. The smell." "Yes, I know, but we've come this far." Step by step they descended. The staircase was steep and damp. The walls were slick with icy condensation, and the air grew colder with every step. Thomas counted the steps. 20, 30, 40. The cellar was far deeper than he had imagined. Finally, the staircase ended at a landing. A heavy wooden door stood before them. And beneath it seeped a faint orange glow. Thomas exchanged a look with Daniel. Now they could hear sounds, a continuous murmur, steady and rhythmic like a chant. "Someone's in there," Daniel whispered, fear trembling in his voice. Thomas placed his hand on the handle. It was cold as ice. He turned it slowly, infinitely slowly, and pushed the door open. What they saw made them freeze where they stood, their minds refusing to comprehend what their eyes were seeing. The cellar was vast, far larger than the chapel above, as though tunnels had been dug deep into the earth. Dozens of candles burned along the walls, casting a flickering, otherworldly light. But it wasn't the architecture that paralyzed them. It was the bodies. They were there, arranged in perfect rows like worshippers seated in pews. Some sat, others knelt, all frozen in poses of prayer. Their hands were clasped, their heads bowed, and their faces. Thomas felt his stomach churn. The faces were intact, preserved in a way that defied all understanding. The skin was waxy, almost translucent, but there was no sign of decay. Their eyes were closed, their lips slightly parted, as if they were whispering prayers. "My God!" Daniel's whisper barely escaped his throat. Thomas recognized some of the faces. John Peterson was there, kneeling in the first row, his strong farmer's hands joined in an eternal prayer. Mary Sullivan sat not far behind, her head gently tilted, long black hair framing a face locked in an eerie serenity. And there were others, so many others, faces Thomas knew from the village, people whose disappearances had been explained away as voluntary departures. "He killed them," Daniel murmured, his voice breaking with horror. "Father Morrow killed them all." But Thomas noticed something else. At the far end of that macabre crypt, a table stood, covered with vials, jars of various colored liquids, strips of cloth, and strange instruments. Shelves were lined with ancient books, their leather bindings cracked with age. Thomas approached, his lantern trembling in his hand, and read a few of the titles. De Conservant Corpus, Treatise on Sacred Embalming, The Mysteries of Divine Preservation. Notebooks lay open on the table. Thomas picked one up and began to read the tightly written entries. The words froze his blood even more than the sight of the corpses. November, the process improves. I have perfected the mixture of resin, essential oils, and mineral salts. The flesh no longer corrupts. Death itself seems suspended. Is this the miracle I have awaited? Proof that faith can transcend natural law. January 3, 1917. Mary Sullivan confided in me during confession. Her faith is pure, her soul unblemished. She will be perfect to join the eternal congregation. She does not know it yet, but I shall grant her the greatest gift, immortality in prayer. January 28, 1917. 23 souls preserved. 23 faithful who shall pray for eternity, safe from corruption, from decay, from indignity, from death. My work progresses. God has chosen me to accomplish this miracle. Thomas closed the notebook, his hands shaking violently. He's mad, completely mad. He thinks he's saving them. Thomas, we have to leave now. Tell the authorities, Daniel urged. But before they could move, a voice rose behind them, soft and terribly calm. I was wondering when someone would discover my sanctuary. The two boys spun around in unison. Father Augustin Morrow stood in the doorway, dressed in his black cassock, his pale blue eyes fixed on them with a chilling intensity. In his hands, he held a large candle, its flame casting dancing shadows across his gaunt face. Father Morrow, Thomas's voice was strangled by fear. The priest smiled, a smile utterly devoid of warmth. You don't understand, do you? You see horror where there is beauty, madness where there is faith. He stepped slowly into the crypt, moving between the rows of preserved bodies like a shepherd among his flock. Look at them, they are at peace, safe from rot, from vermin, from oblivion. They pray for us all eternally in this sacred space I have created. Is that not the most beautiful destiny? You murdered them, Daniel shouted, suddenly finding courage. Father Morrow's expression hardened. Murdered, no, my child, saved, purified, raised to a higher state. Ordinary death is an abomination, rotting flesh, worms that devour, dust that scatters. But them I preserved in their purity. You're a monster, Thomas whispered. The priest stopped a few paces away. In the flickering candlelight, his face looked like that of a specter, half prophet, half fiend. I have studied for years the ancient arts of preservation, he said quietly. I prayed for divine guidance, and God. He answered. He showed me how to keep his followers in a permanent state of grace. God never asked you to kill, shouted Thomas, slowly backing toward the exit. Kill, replied Father Morrow. I offered them immortality, a place in my eternal church. Look around you, isn't it magnificent? Daniel grabbed Thomas by the arm, and the two bolted for the stairs. Father Morrow's laughter echoed behind them, a hollow, terrible sound that seemed to fill the entire basement. Run then, warn the authorities, but they too will understand. They will see the beauty of my work. The two young men flew up the steps 4 at a time, breathless, terror giving wings to their flight. They burst out of the chapel and sprinted through the snow toward the village center, pounding on the sheriff's door with desperate frenzy. Dawn was only beginning to break over Belmont when Sheriff William Hayes, accompanied by 3 deputies and a dozen townsmen, made their way to St. Mary's Chapel. Thomas and Daniel had alerted them during the night, and though their story had at first seemed unbelievable, the sheer panic in their eyes and the consistency of their account convinced the sheriff to investigate immediately. Father Morrow awaited them on the chapel's front steps, standing motionless in the snow like a statue. He neither fled nor resisted when the men surrounded him. His face bore a disturbing serenity, almost ecstatic. Sheriff Hayes, he said calmly, I suppose these young men have told you about my sanctuary. Father Morrow, replied the sheriff, his hand resting cautiously on his revolver, we need to inspect the basement of this chapel. By all means, said the priest, stepping aside. Enter, see my work, understand what I have accomplished in the name of God. What followed remained forever etched in the memory of all who descended into that crypt. Even the most hardened men, used to the grim realities of rural life and even death itself, emerged pale-faced, some retching violently. Sheriff Hayes himself, a 50-year-old man who had seen everything in his career, had to lean against a wall to catch his breath. The bodies were exactly as Thomas and Daniel had described. the missing townspeople, all preserved in a state that defied natural law, arranged in postures of prayer, forming a macabre parody of a congregation. The discovery shook Belmont to its core. Within hours, telegrams were sent to federal authorities. Doctors and investigators arrived from Lincoln and even Omaha. The small chapel became the focus of national attention, drawing journalists and onlookers despite the authorities' efforts to seal the site. Dr. Samuel Brennan, a coroner sent from the capital, examined the bodies with a mix of fascination and horror. He wrote a detailed report that would later be cited in newspapers across the country. The bodies display an extraordinary state of preservation, achieved through a complex embalming process that combines ancient techniques with Father Morrow's personal innovations. The tissues show no signs of advanced decomposition, though some of the deceased have been dead for over a year. Analysis of the substances used reveals a blend of natural resins, essential oils, mineral salts, and formaldehyde, applied with almost surgical precision. Most disturbing is the care given to the arrangement of the bodies. Each victim was positioned in a specific posture, hands joined in prayer, faces sculpted into expressions of spiritual peace. Father Morrow treated these people not as corpses, but as full members of a congregation he believed eternal. During his interrogation, Father Augustine Morrow showed no remorse. Seated in a temporary cell inside the sheriff's office, he answered questions with the same eerie calm, utterly convinced of the righteousness of his actions. "How did you choose your victims?" asked Federal Inspector Marcus Thunton, a hard man who had investigated countless crimes. "Victims?" Father Morrow shook his head. "You used the wrong term, Inspector. They were chosen ones, pure souls I selected for their exemplary faith, their sincere devotion. Each of them deserved preservation to escape the indignity of ordinary death." "How did you kill them?" "I did not kill them," Morrow said quietly. "I transferred them from one state of existence to another, higher one." He paused, his blue eyes locking on the inspector with unnerving intensity. "Do you understand? Death as we know it is corruption. The body decays, becomes food for worms, returns to dust. It is an abomination, an insult to divine creation. But through the proper ritual, through ancient knowledge and faith, one can transcend that corruption." "Answer the question," the inspector demanded. "How did you do it?" Father Morrow sighed, like a teacher disappointed by a dull student. Like a teacher facing a particularly slow student. "I invited them to share a blessed meal, a private communion. The drink contained a tincture of Paul and other herbs to induce a deep, peaceful sleep. Once unconscious, I proceeded with the ritual of preservation, the injection of the conserving fluids, the arrangement of the body into its proper posture, the prayers of consecration. They did not suffer. It was a gentle passage to their new state." "New state? They're dead, Father Morrow. You poisoned and embalmed them." "Their flesh is preserved, and with it, their spiritual essence. In my sanctuary they pray eternally. Is that not the paradise all religions promise? An infinite spiritual existence, sheltered from suffering and time itself." The interrogation went on for hours. Father Morrow revealed how he had begun his preservation experiments years earlier, first on small animals, then on already deceased bodies that he exhumed from the cemetery. Gradually consumed by the idea of creating an eternal congregation, he moved to what he called active recruitment, the premeditated murder of parishioners chosen for their piety. Margaret Hoffman, Thomas's mother, was questioned by the authorities. Devastated, she recounted how Father Morrow had invited her several times for private, spiritual consultations, invitations she had politely declined, feeling inexplicably uneasy. "He looked at me in a strange way," she told Inspector Thornton, her hands trembling around her teacup, "as if he were assessing something. I thought it was just my imagination, but now, my God, I could have been one of them. My son, too." The families of the victims were summoned to identify their loved ones. These moments were heartbreaking. To see a lost relative again, preserved in a state almost lifelike, yet to know they had been dead for months, even over a year. Some relatives collapsed before the bodies, unable to endure the shock. Others stood stoic, frozen in a silence heavy with grief and incomprehension. Harold Peterson, brother of John, stared for a long time at his elder brother's preserved face before turning to the authorities. He had his whole life ahead of him, a wife waiting, plans, a future. And this monster turned him into a thing, a macabre doll to feed his madness. The investigation also revealed that Father Morrow had left traces of his obsession for years, but no one had wanted, or dared, to interpret them. His sermons had grown darker, focused more and more on corruption and death. He repeatedly asked the diocese for old books on embalming techniques. He spent long nights alone in the chapel. All warning signs, ignored or rationalized by a community that trusted its spiritual guide. The bishop of the diocese, Monsignor Patrick O'Connell, personally traveled to Belmont. Visibly shaken, he addressed the faithful gathered in the village's community hall, the chapel now sealed off as a crime scene. "What has occurred here is an abomination," he declared, his grave voice echoing through the stunned silence. "It has nothing to do with the Catholic faith or with God. Father Morrow has betrayed his priesthood, his community, and the very teachings of Christ. He will be judged by the laws of men, and his soul will answer before God for his unspeakable crimes." But for the people of Belmont, his words brought little comfort. Trust was shattered, safety destroyed. How could they ever feel secure again, knowing that the man meant to guide their souls had been a predator hiding in plain sight? Thomas and Daniel were hailed as heroes, but neither young man felt pride. The images of the crypt haunted them night and day. Thomas could no longer close his eyes without seeing the waxen faces of the victims, their hands locked in an eternal, forced prayer. "I wonder how long he would have kept going," he said one evening to Daniel as they sat on the porch of the Hoffman house, watching the chapel now guarded by deputies. "How many of us would have disappeared before anyone realized?" Daniel didn't answer. The question was rhetorical, but the silence that followed was colder than the winter air. "Probably many," he finally said quietly, "many more." The trial of Father Augustin Morrow began in April 1917, 3 months after the gruesome discovery. It was held at the county courthouse, but the national attention it drew was immense. Reporters from New York, Chicago, and even San Francisco came to cover what was already being called the priest of death case. The courtroom was packed every day. The people of Belmont filled the front rows, their faces marked by a mix of morbid fascination and thirst for justice. The families of the victims, dressed in mourning black, sat together in a silent, grief-stricken block, their eyes fixed on the man who had stolen their loved ones. Father Morrow entered the courtroom flanked by 2 guards, his hands bound by handcuffs. He had grown thinner during his detention. His gaunt face now resembled that of a medieval ascetic. His pale blue eyes swept over the courtroom with that same unsettling serenity, as if he were attending a mass rather than standing trial for murder. Prosecutor James Rutherford, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a fearsome reputation, opened the proceedings with a speech of surgical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing slowly before them, "we are here today to judge one of the most monstrous crimes our state, indeed, our nation, has ever known. The accused, Augustin Morrow, coldly murdered 23 innocent souls, men, women, and young adults who trusted him, who saw him as their spiritual guide." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But he did not simply kill them. No, he transformed them into objects of his own madness. He embalmed them, arranged them like dolls in an underground crypt, creating what he dared to call an eternal congregation. He stole their lives, their dignity, and even their right to a decent burial. Rutherford then presented the evidence methodically. Father Morrow's journals detailing each murder, the medical examiner's testimonies about the causes of death, the toxic substances found beneath the chapel, the statements from Thomas and Daniel. Each piece was laid out with merciless clarity. "The accused may claim," Rutherford continued, "that he acted in the name of faith, that he believed himself to be on a divine mission. But faith does not justify murder. God never asked anyone to poison their fellow man and preserve them like specimens in a grotesque collection. What the accused did is not devotion. It is murderous madness disguised as piety." When it was time for the defense, Father Morrow's lawyer, a man named Clarence Whitmore, took an audacious approach. He would plead insanity. Whitmore was an experienced attorney from Lincoln, known for handling impossible cases. He understood that to save his client's life, he would have to convince the jury that Morrow was not a calculating monster, but a profoundly broken man. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began in a calm, steady voice, "I am not here to deny the facts. The acts committed by my client are unspeakable and deeply disturbing. But I am here to ask you to understand the state of mind in which he acted. Augustin Morrow is not an ordinary criminal. He is a man shattered by a pathological obsession, consumed by a delusional belief that completely destroyed his perception of reality." Whitmore then called to the stand a renowned psychiatrist, Dr. Elliot Manning from Chicago. Dr. Manning had examined Father Morrow for several weeks and had formed a complex diagnosis. "The accused suffers from what we call religious psychosis," explained the psychiatrist, adjusting his round glasses. "He developed a delusional belief system in which he perceives himself as a divine instrument, charged with saving souls by preserving their bodies from decay. To him, ordinary death represents an intolerable corruption, an offense to God. In his diseased mind, he believed he was performing an act of ultimate devotion." "Dr. Manning," Whitmore asked, "was the accused capable of distinguishing right from wrong at the time he committed these acts?" The psychiatrist hesitated before responding carefully. "It's a complex question. Intellectually, yes. He understood that society viewed his actions as reprehensible, but on an emotional and spiritual level, no. He was utterly convinced, with absolute certainty, that he was doing good. This conviction was not a conscious choice. It was the product of a mental illness that had gradually destroyed his ability to perceive reality objectively." Prosecutor Rutherford rose for cross-examination, his tone sharp and cutting. "Dr. Manning," he began, "would a man suffering from the psychosis you describe be capable of meticulously planning his crimes, of concealing bodies for months, even years, and maintaining a facade of normalcy before his community. The psychiatrist hesitated. Psychosis does not necessarily exclude the ability to plan. Please, doctor, Rutherford interrupted. Just answer the question, yes or no. It's complicated, Manning replied. Then let me rephrase, the prosecutor said, his voice cold and deliberate. The accused kept detailed journals of his crimes, did he not? He documented every victim, every step of his process. He built an elaborate underground laboratory. He lied to the families of the missing, inventing stories to explain their absences. All of this required forethought, awareness, calculation. Tell me, doctor, is that the behavior of a man completely detached from reality? Dr. Manning had no choice but to concede. The case indeed showed unusual traits for a pure psychosis. Then came the most anticipated moment of the trial, when Father Morrow himself was called to testify. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The courtroom fell silent as he stepped toward the witness stand, his movements slow and deliberate. He took the oath in a clear voice, then turned to face the audience. For more than 2 hours he spoke. He told how, as a newly ordained young priest, he had been deeply disturbed by the funerals he had to preside over, the sight of decomposing bodies, the stench of decay, the speed with which the divine flesh turned to rot. This obsession, he said, became a daily torment. I began to study, he explained in a soft but firm voice. Ancient texts, Egyptian embalming rituals, the techniques of saints whose bodies were miraculously preserved. I prayed for understanding, and one day, in a moment of grace, the answer came to me. If we are created in the image of God, how could our physical form be meant for corruption? Decomposition is not divine will, it is the result of original sin. But through faith and knowledge, we can transcend this curse. So you began to kill, interrupted the prosecutor, Rutherford, curtly. Father Morrow looked at him with an expression that was almost pity. I never killed anyone, Mr. Prosecutor. I offered deliverance. Every person I chose was pure of heart, devoted in faith. I spared them the degradation of ordinary death. In my sanctuary they exist in a state of perpetual grace, their bodies preserved, their souls in constant communion with the divine. They're dead, suddenly shouted a voice from the gallery. You killed my son. It was Harold Peterson, his face twisted with grief and rage. The guards had to restrain him as he tried to lunge at the accused. The judge struck his gavel several times, demanding order. Father Morrow, unshaken, continued. I understand your pain, Mr. Peterson, but your son did not suffer. He fell asleep peacefully, and when he awoke, he was already in his new state. He prays for you now in my sanctuary. He prays for us all. Enough. Judge William Crawford, an austere man with silver hair, rose in anger. Mr. Morrow, you are charged with 23 counts of murder. Do you admit to having caused the deaths of these people? I facilitated their transition to a higher state of existence. Answer yes or no. Father Morrow was silent for a long time. His pale eyes scanned the room, the grieving families, the stern-faced jurors, the reporters scribbling furiously. Then he smiled, a gentle yet terrifying smile. Yes, Your Honor, I caused the cessation of their ordinary vital functions, but in exchange, I gave them something far more precious. The closing arguments were intense. Prosecutor Rutherford hammered home the point that Father Morrow had been fully aware of his actions, that he acted with premeditation, and no mental illness could excuse such horror. This man, Rutherford declared, pointing a finger at the accused, used his position of trust to lure innocent victims into a death trap. He poisoned their drinks, watched them fall asleep, then turned them into objects of his morbid collection. He robbed 23 families of their loved ones. He terrorized an entire community, and now he dares to claim it was a divine mission. No, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what Father Morrow has done is nothing short of the work of the devil himself. The defense attorney, Whitmore, played his final card. Make no mistake, my client's acts are monstrous, but a true monster knows he is committing evil. Augustin Morrow sincerely believes he was doing good. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the very definition of madness. Hanging him will only punish a sick man. What he needs is not the executioner's rope, but lifelong psychiatric confinement. The jury deliberated for 4 long days, an unusually long time, showing how fiercely divided they were. Finally, the verdict came. Guilty of premeditated murder on all 23 counts. The insanity plea was rejected. When Judge Crawford pronounced the sentence, his voice echoed through the heavy silence. Augustin Morrow, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul. Father Morrow received the verdict without a flinch. As he was led out of the courtroom, he turned one last time toward the audience and murmured, just loud enough to be heard, "My work lives on. In that crypt they still pray, and they always will." The months following the trial were marked by a painful attempt at returning to normalcy in Belmont. But normalcy now seemed impossible. The St. Mary Chapel remained sealed by ecclesiastical order. The bodies of the victims were returned to their families for proper burials, yet the trauma of seeing them so eerily preserved would never fade. Margaret Hoffman left Belmont with Thomas a few weeks after the trial. She could no longer bear walking past the chapel each day or seeing haunted looks from his neighbors, of living in a town that had become synonymous with horror. They moved to Omaha, where Thomas found work in a print shop. But even there, more than 100 km from Belmont, the nightmares continued. Thomas woke sweating in the middle of the night, convinced he heard ghostly murmurs of prayer, convinced he saw the waxen faces of the victims turning toward him in the dark. He consulted several doctors, but no remedy could erase the images burned into his memory. Daniel Cartwright stayed in Belmont. He returned to his work at the forge, but something in him had broken. His friends noticed he spoke little, that he jumped at the slightest sound, that he avoided passing by the chapel even in broad daylight. He began to drink, first moderately, then more and more, seeking in the bottle a forgetting he never quite found. One autumn evening in 1917, as night fell over Belmont, Daniel made the ill-advised decision to return to the chapel alone. Perhaps he sought a confrontation with his demons, or perhaps drink had simply clouded his judgment. He forced the seals on the main door and entered the deserted building. The interior was plunged in near-total darkness. Dust had gathered on the pews, and the scent inside had been replaced by that of abandonment and damp. Daniel lit a lantern and made his way toward the basement door, driven by an impulse he himself couldn't explain. The crypt had been emptied of its macabre occupants, but the atmosphere remained oppressive, charged with an indefinable presence. The candles were gone. The instruments and vials had been seized as evidence, yet their traces remained. The places on the floor where the bodies had been laid, stains on the stone, the empty shelves that had held treatises on embalming. Daniel stood motionless, looking around, and then he heard something. A whisper so faint he might have dismissed it as imagination. But it was real. A sound like a prayer murmured under one's breath, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He rushed for the exit, scrambling up the stairs in a panic, abandoning his lantern which shattered on the floor. He burst out of the chapel and ran home, trembling, convinced something had followed him out of that cursed crypt. The next morning Daniel was found hanged in his room. He had left a brief, troubling note. "I still hear them. I can't make them stop." His death plunged Belmont into a new wave of grief and bewilderment. From his cell, awaiting execution, Father Morrow learned the news with what appeared to be satisfaction. "You see," he told the guard who brought his meal, "even dead, my sanctuary exerts its power. The work continues." Father Augustin Morrow's execution took place on November 15, 1917, exactly 1 year after he had written in his journal that he had perfected his preservation process. A large crowd gathered outside the prison, some demanding justice, others drawn by morbid curiosity. The priest walked to the gallows with the same serenity that had marked his demeanor throughout the trial. He refused the services of a clergyman, declaring he needed no one to intercede with God. He said he had his own direct conversation with the divine. His last words, before the executioner placed the black hood over his head, rang through the tense silence. "The flesh decays, but the spirit endures. In my chapel, 23 souls pray for eternity. My work will outlive my physical death. The eternal sanctuary exists. Nothing can destroy it." The trapdoor opened. Father Morrow's body dropped. His neck snapped cleanly. Even in death, his face retained the look of a man convinced he had accomplished something great. The ecclesiastical authorities made a radical decision. St. Mary's Chapel would be destroyed. One could not allow a house of worship turned into a house of horror to remain, a building forever associated with the most monstrous crimes. In December, workers began the demolition. But when they reached the basement, they discovered something not mentioned in the initial investigation reports. Behind the back wall of the crypt was a second, smaller chamber that Father Morrow had apparently kept secret even from the investigators. In this hidden room, they found additional notebooks, architectural sketches, and most disturbingly, a personal journal in which the priest detailed not only his past crimes but also his future plans. He intended to expand his eternal sanctuary, to include up to 100 souls, perhaps more. He had even identified his next potential victims, whose names were carefully listed. Among those names were Thomas Hoffman and Daniel Cartwright. "If they discover my work," he had written a few days before his arrest, "they will be the first to truly understand. Their youth and purity of heart will make them perfect additions to my congregation. They resist now, but in preserved death they will find peace." That revelation froze the blood of everyone who read it. Father Morrow had not simply been a mad murderer. He had been a calculating predator who planned every detail of his crime's expansion. The demolition of the chapel continued. The basement was filled with concrete. The diocese ordered that a simple memorial garden be built in its place, dedicated to the victims, with a modest plaque bearing only their names and the dates of their birth and disappearance. There was no mention of Father Morrow or his atrocities. They wanted to honor the victims, not immortalize the executioner. But the people of Belmont knew, and they never forgot. As the years went by, stories began to circulate. Some claimed to hear whispered prayers at night when passing near the old site of the chapel. Others swore they had seen a figure in a black cassock standing beside the memorial garden, motionless, staring at the ground as if contemplating something invisible. Thomas Hoffman, now an adult, never returned to Belmont. He married, had children, and tried to build a normal life in Omaha. But until his final days, he kept a small silver cross beside his bed. Every night before sleeping, he said a prayer, not for his own salvation, but for the 23 souls that Father Morrow had torn from life. "I hope they've found peace," he confided to his eldest son decades later. "Father Morrow believed he had preserved them for eternity, but I pray they've managed to escape his grasp, even in death. No one deserves to remain trapped in another man's madness, not even after leaving this world." Margaret Hoffman, Thomas's mother, spoke very little about that period of her life. When she died, among her personal belongings, they found a single item linked to Belmont, a photograph of St. Mary's Chapel taken before the events, with words written on the back. "We thought it was a house of God. We were wrong. May the lost souls finally rest in peace." Belmont itself never truly recovered from the trauma. The population gradually declined over the decades. Young people left as soon as they could, unwilling to live in a town marked by such a dark history. By 1965, Belmont had only about 80 inhabitants left, and many houses were abandoned. Strangely, however, the memorial garden always remained perfectly maintained, though no one knew who tended to it. Flowers grew there with unusual vitality, even in winter. Some said the earth at that spot felt warmer than the surrounding ground, as if something deep below still radiated a strange energy. Paranormal researchers visited the site several times during the 1970s and 1980s. Some recorded unexplained acoustic phenomena, voices murmuring in Latin, reciting prayers. Others reported feelings of intense unease, nausea, or the unsettling sense of being watched by an invisible presence. One of these researchers, Professor Michael Brennan from the University of Nebraska, no relation to the 1917 coroner, published a controversial study in 1982 suggesting that collective trauma could imprint itself on a place in measurable ways. He cited Belmont as his prime example. "What happened here was so intensely horrific," he wrote, "that it left a scar in the very fabric of the place itself. The 23 victims, torn from life and forced into a grotesque parody of eternal devotion, may have left an imprint that transcends our normal understanding of reality." Today, Belmont is practically a ghost town. Most of the buildings lie in ruins, swallowed by vegetation. Only the memorial garden remains intact, its flowers still blooming mysteriously, no matter the season. The few visitors who venture there all report the same disturbing sensation, a silence that feels too deep, an atmosphere that presses on the chest, and the eerie impression that something or someone is still there, watching, waiting, praying perhaps in the forgotten depths beneath the concrete. Father Augustine Morrow has been dead for over a century. His victims too. Yet the shadow of what happened in that Nebraska chapel in 1917 still lingers, a chilling reminder that sometimes misguided faith can give birth to the darkest horrors. And on certain nights, when the wind blows through the ruins of Belmont, those who listen closely swear they can still hear, carried by the breeze, the faint murmur of 23 voices reciting prayers they never chose to speak. Father Morrow, eternal sanctuary, may no longer exist in stone, but in memory, in nightmares, and perhaps somewhere between life and death, it endures, a terrible testament to what happens when devotion turns into madness. When obsession merges with devotion, the boundary between saving souls and destroying them disappears completely. The 23 victims deserved life, a natural death, and true peace. What they received instead remains one of the darkest tragedies in American history, not because of the number of deaths, but because of the deep and lasting violation of their very humanity. Father Augustin Morrow believed he was creating something eternal and sacred. Instead, he built a monument to human madness, a warning carved in stone and blood, that the road to hell is paved not only with good intentions, but sometimes with sincere prayers and misguided faith. And within that terrible truth lies perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all, that the deepest evil does not always come from those who reject God, but sometimes from those who believe they serve Him too zealously, until they lose sight of the very heart of His teaching: love, respect for life, and the sacred dignity of every human soul. Belmont, Nebraska, 1917. 23 lives stolen. One mad priest. And a sanctuary that, in some strange way, may never have truly ceased to exist.